Hi, everyone. I'm Crista Cowan. I'm the corporate genealogist here at Ancestry. And today we are talking about newspapers. If you have been doing family history for any amount of time, you probably already know the power of newspapers to help break through brick walls, to answer questions you maybe didn't even know you had, and sometimes to uncover some heartwarming or salacious stories, depending on what was being reported in the local newspaper at the time your ancestors were living there. Now, there are a lot of different ways to search newspapers, and that's what we're going to spend the bulk of our hour together today talking about. But I do just want to make sure we're really clear about what is available on newspapers.com and how you access it. So, Ancestry owns a website called newspapers.com. It is maintained as a separate website for several reasons. One is because there are a lot of people who are interested in social history, who are interested in different aspects of newspapers research that aren't necessarily interested in family history. And so searching on Ancestry wouldn't necessarily occur to them. So newspapers.com, one of the reasons we maintain it as a separate site is so that we can serve that audience of people as well. Now, I know you and I can't imagine people who aren't interested in family history, but they are out there. So that means that you need access to newspapers.com in order to fully research your family. And that means that on Ancestry, if you have the highest tier of subscription, which here in the US is typically going to be called All Access, what that means is that you have access to all the records in your country with a country level subscription. Here in the US, it would be a US subscription. In Canada, it would be a Canadian subscription, so on. There is a world level subscription, which gives you access to all of the records on Ancestry. And then there is that all access subscription, which gives you access to all of the records on Ancestry and all of the records on newspapers.com and all of the records on Fold 3. Now, again, that's the way that the subscription packages are structured here in the US, but you may, if you are in Canada or the UK or Australia or elsewhere, have a different subscription package available to you. So just be sure to check your account to see what level of membership you have, and then from there you can see what memberships are offered. Now, all that said, if you just want US records only or just Canadian records only, but you also want access to newspapers.com, you can subscribe to that site separately. And so just so you know, that's how you're going to get access to that. So we answered the biggest question right up front, which is how do you get access to newspapers.com? And again, it's entirely based on which Ancestry subscription you have. And then if you have a lower tier subscription, you just need to subscribe to newspapers separately. So then let's answer the second question today, which is, well, why would I want newspapers? I would love to hear from you in the chat or the comments if you're watching later on YouTube. I would love to hear a little bit about what discoveries you have made in newspapers. So we're going to start with the biggest breakthrough discovery. What is the biggest breakthrough discovery that you made in a newspaper? And I'll tell a brief experience of my own while you are sharing that. I had a woman in my family tree whose maiden name I did not know, and I had been looking for quite a while. I had not been able to find a marriage record for her and her husband. I had found no birth records for her children. Most of them were born before newspapers or before birth certificates were issued. Death certificates for the one child that I had been able to find did not list his mother's maiden name. As a matter of fact, the person who had provided the information on the death certificate did not know the first or last names of either of his parents. And so it just said, don't know and don't know. And I was getting increasingly frustrated trying to find information about her. Unfortunately, she had a fairly common first name. And so finding that was a little bit tricky, like trying to identify who she was among all the women with that name. So I started looking through newspapers for obituaries and birth announcements and marriage announcements for her children and her husband to see if I could ever find her mentioned by a maiden name. And again, I struck out over and over and over again. Until one day I was going through the local newspaper in the neighboring town near where they lived, and there was a tiny little notation, just like a 2-line notation, about how she had gone to visit her brother and his family and had just come back into town. Well, her brother had a last name that I was able to then use as a clue to prove that that was in fact her maiden name. And ultimately, that led me to the marriage record, which I hadn't been able to find previously because her husband had only been listed by his initials, and one of them was wrong on the marriage record. So newspapers helped me identify a maiden name when I had exhausted all other resources for that particular woman in my family tree. So again, if you've had a breakthrough similar to that, I would love to hear about it. And you might also want to read through the chat or the comments to see what kinds of information other people are finding. Now, in that example, one of the things you may have heard was they put a notation in the newspaper about her going to visit someone and coming back from a vacation. And yes, absolutely. One of the things I often say is that newspapers were the Facebook of their day. People would report on all sorts of things. So it's not just the big news, especially in small town papers. They're trying to fill up column inches, and they would have society news. They would have local news in each of the little communities around where the newspaper was published. They would have information about things like who left to go serve in the military. And the parents would then report when he finished basic training or when he had come home on leave or when he was changed, his assignment was changed and he was moved to another place. You'll see things as trivial as who held a dinner party and what they served and what card game they played afterwards, or who sang at the local community function and what song they sang and who the accompanist was. All of those kind of little minutia details that now we just share out on Facebook and Instagram, those were the kinds of things that were often reported on in local newspapers. So you're not just going to find big things, big news, salacious news, marriages, births, and deaths. You're also going to sometimes find, as you read through some of these community papers, a rhythm of the life that was being lived in that community. Whether your ancestor was mentioned or not, that is interesting to start to give you context for the kind of community that they lived in. So when I'm doing newspapers research, there are two things that I am looking for. One is, how do I validate information about the identity of people in my family tree? What's the maiden name? When was the baby born? Who is mentioned in the obituary? All of those kinds of genealogical framework pieces of information and facts that we're always trying to find records to correlate, to validate. I'm also then looking for what were the stories happening in the community, and can I string enough of these together to get a picture of what life was like for this person or this family in my family tree. So that's what I use newspapers for. And of course, there are so many other reasons that you will see as we spend our time together today. So here's what we're going to spend the rest of our time together doing. And I see some of you still in the chat sharing the things you found in newspapers. I think the next thing I would like to hear from you is, what is one of the most surprising or salacious things that you have found in a newspaper? Because news then, and I'm talking early 1900s, mid 1800s, sometimes even the early 1800s, news then was no different than news now. They were trying to sell papers. And so they would put the biggest news of the day, they would splash headlines that would cause people, instead of clicking, would cause people to want to buy the paper and read it. And so you sometimes get the most salacious things being reported on repeatedly, people following court trials or crimes that occurred. In my family, the most surprising thing we ever found was that the great great grandfather who abandoned his wife and teenage children, that we thought ran off with a 19-year-old and went out to California to make his fortune, it turns out that California was not his first stop, and that 19-year-old was not who he abandoned my great great grandmother for. In fact, he eloped with a young girl from another community and went down to Little Rock for a while and opened a print shop. Eventually, he did abandon her for her 19-year-old friend and went out to California. But here is what we didn't know. We didn't know about that second wife, and we also didn't know that his divorce from wife number one was not finalized when his marriage to wife number two was announced by her parents in the newspaper. And in fact, when it was announced in the newspaper by her parents, wife number one, my great great grandmother, her lawyer saw the announcement and immediately filed bigamy charges in the court. That was splashed all over the newspaper, and not just the newspaper in her community in Ohio, but in their home community in Ohio, in the second wife's community in Indiana, and it made its way down to Little Rock, where eventually I suspect it may have affected his business, and that may have something to do with why he took off and went out to California. So the local newspapers love a good salacious story, and if it's being reported in one paper, sometimes it's being reported in many papers, and every reporter kind of has their own take on how they tell the story, or every editor has so much space to tell the story, and so you might get more or less details included depending. So that's my second question to you, if you haven't already shared in the chat or in the comments, is what salacious or surprising stories have you discovered in newspapers? That was certainly mine. So I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to walk through a couple of ways that you can make discoveries in newspapers. And Ancestry has done our best to make this as easy as possible for you. So let me explain to you a little bit about how Ancestry has indexed newspapers.com. So I mentioned earlier, it is a separate website. Requires you to log in, have a subscription either through Ancestry or directly with newspapers.com. But several years ago, Ancestry realized the value of having the records on newspapers searchable through Ancestry. And so we started creating databases out of the names found in those newspapers. We started with obituaries. So we have AI technology that several years ago was able to look at a page of newspaper, identify where the boundaries of each article were on that newspaper, index the information in the article, and then extract that index to create a searchable record more than just a block of words, right? Traditional OCR indexing of typewritten documents was always just what we lovingly called a bag of words. You could find a word anywhere on the page. But with AI, we've been able to create hundreds of millions. As a matter of fact, there might even be billions in some cases. There are of records from articles on newspapers.com. If you come to the card catalog on Ancestry and type in newspapers.com, you will see currently there are 69 different databases of records that have been created from those indexes that Ancestry generated on newspapers. The obituary index, so if I type in obituary, you'll see there are 4 databases of obituaries. They contain, like this one contains 1.2 billion records, 47 million, 32 million, 5 million. So you can see we've broken them out by country. And each of these databases is then updated on a fairly regular basis. You can see when you hover over the database title, this particular database was published in September of 2019, but it was last updated on June 30th of this year. And that means I suspect that it will be updated here in the next few weeks. I think if last I heard, they're updated about every 8 to 10 or 12 weeks. Why would a database need to be updated? 2 reasons. 1, new newspapers are still being published, and Ancestry has agreements with some of the large publishers to host their data, their newspapers. And so new newspapers come online, or new editions of newspapers constantly with modern news. And so those get added to the database. In addition, the newspapers.com team here at Ancestry is always looking to acquire additional historic newspaper titles. So if a set of newspapers was microfilmed decades ago and it was from the 1800s, they might negotiate with the archive or the library or the publisher, whoever owns the rights to those original newspapers, in order to publish them on the site. And so new newspaper editions and titles from different places around the world are constantly coming online or being published. And so then those have to be indexed, and indexes need to be created that then roll into these databases. So on Ancestry, these indexes get updated every few months. And you can see, again, when they were last updated. If you just hover over that title, it will pop up that little screen. So the obituary index was the first one that Ancestry did, because obituaries are A, really, really rich in genealogical information, and B, really useful for family history. And so we wanted to make sure that we had as much information, like they're really useful for like connecting the dots and family stories. We wanted to make sure you had as much of that available to you on Ancestry as possible. And so we published those first. Then we went back through the newspapers.com collection with the AI indexes, and we tagged which articles were marriage related. Now, when I say marriage related, here's what I mean. Sometimes there's a full wedding announcement with a picture of the bride and an article detailing exactly who wore what and who played what song and who was manning the cake table. Sometimes there's an engagement announcement about the fact that this couple is going to get married on such and such a date, with the details about where the bride and groom went to school and what they're planning on doing after they get married. Sometimes it's just a one-line little snippet because the local courthouse provided the newspaper with a list of here are all the people who applied for marriage licenses in the last week, and it lists the name of the bride and groom and their age and maybe their hometown. So all of those are considered marriage-related records. And so you might get a full-blown article, you might get a little single-line snippet about a marriage license application. You might get all three: an engagement announcement, a marriage license application, and an actual wedding announcement. You might just get a little snippet that talks about the parents of the bride going to a different town to attend the wedding. So all of those things where the Ancestry algorithm can identify that this article, however big or small in the newspaper, is talking about a wedding or a marriage, it's going to be tagged as such and included in this index. And again, you can see several million, hundreds of millions of those have been identified. The next database that Ancestry decided to create of indexes out of newspapers.com images is what we call the Stories and Events Index. So the Stories and Events Index is simply all the other things that people get talked about in the newspaper. So if somebody earned a Boy Scout merit badge and it was mentioned in the newspaper, if somebody went away in the military and it was mentioned in the newspaper, if somebody was arrested for a crime or went to go see their new grandbaby or came home from a vacation and put on a community event, or like all the different ways that people get mentioned in the newspaper, where there's an identifiable name, place, and date, then Ancestry was able to include those in the index. And you can see here, there are more of these databases and they are exponentially larger. So much larger, in fact, that Ancestry broke these databases up here in the US into specific states. So you'll see a stories and events index per state for here in the United States. And then you will also see the country level ones for England and Canada and Australia. Okay, same thing, you can hover over it. It will tell you when those were last published and then when they were last updated. Now, unlike the marriage and the obituary indexes, these ones do not get updated quite as often. Part of it has to do with the massive size of them. So they do get updated, but maybe not quite as often as the others, okay? So that's how we've been able to take all of the images over on newspapers.com, using AI, identify the boundaries of articles, using another AI algorithm, indexing those articles, tagging them with the kind of record it is, and then creating these databases on Ancestry. You will receive hints in your tree to these databases. So when you're in Ancestry and you see a little record hint, you can go into that, and if it's a newspapers.com hint, you should be able to tell that fairly quickly. For example, here on my bigamist great-great-grandfather, you can see I have another newspapers hint. And again, they'll show up as those newspapers get indexed, as those databases get updated and refreshed. When you go to view the hint, here's what you will see. So you will see a little snippet or a thumbnail of the article. You will see an extraction, an AI extraction of some of the information from the article. Sometimes that's not enough. Rarely is it enough to really know what the article is about. The purpose of the index is just to be able to hint it out or find things in a search. And so this is telling me that Park W. Cowan, which is my guy's name, was mentioned in a January 1902 newspaper in Mansfield, Ohio. Well, I do know he was living in Ohio in 1902, so it very possibly could be him, but I always want to view that original image. And again, you do need a newspapers.com subscription, either as part of your Ancestry subscription or standalone, in order to view this original image. Now, this is Mansfield, Ohio, January 1902. I've never looked at this image before, so who knows what we're going to find. Society Gossip of the Day. That's the name of the column that he is mentioned in. And if I scroll down, I'm looking for, here we go. Let's see what it says. We're going to read this together. A special from Muncie, Indiana, today's Cincinnati Enquirer contains an announcement. This is another announcement of his wedding to wife number 2. Announcement of the wedding of Park Cowan. You'll notice his name. Okay, this is also important when you're doing newspaper research. Do you see here? His name looks like it's spelled C-O-W-E-N, but then everywhere else it's spelled C-O-W-A-N. But if that was the only mention, I might not have gotten a hint or seen this record doing a search, because newspapers spell things wrong all the time, okay? So keep that in mind. The wedding of Park Cowan, well known here. Mr. Cowan is the son of the late Robert Cowan, formerly postmaster at Ashland, where his mother still lives. He has relatives here. Mr. Cowan at one time lived in Bucyrus, which is where my great-grandfather was born. The dispatch is as follows. And then this is the article that wife number 2's parents published in the newspaper that eventually got him in trouble. They eloped, and then she wrote a letter back to her mother. And you're going to see this information. Mrs. Cowan, okay, has brought suit for divorce in Dayton, but it was not known here that the case had been entirely settled. Indeed, it was the impression that it had not. So the local paper in Ohio is saying, hey, we don't think his divorce is final, even though this wedding announcement was published in the newspaper in Indiana. So yet another article about his bigamy. They just keep popping up. It was big news in the day, for sure. So that's how those hints are going to look on Ancestry. Now, what you'll notice here is the Social Chronicle is the full article, and there's dozens of people mentioned in the gossip column, but just this one little snippet is about him, this little paragraph or few paragraphs from here to here, right? So I have some options about how to save this. I can just come here from the hint, just like you process a normal hint, and I can say, yes, this is him, and I can just attach it that way. I could also, if I was so inclined, clip the article here on newspapers.com so that I am just seeing the boundaries of the specific article that I am interested in. So if I come down here and I just move these clipping boundaries so that it highlights just the article that I want it to highlight. There we go. I'm not real steady when I'm not using a mouse. Okay, so there's, and then I would give this clip a title. So this is Cowan Park 1902 wedding announcement. Okay, and I could add tags, right? Wedding announcement, whatever else I wanted to add, and then click save. And what that does is it now saves this clip in a clippings file for me on my newspapers.com account. And I could also save it this way on my tree on Ancestry. So now I've got the source and the index attached with a link to the image. And then I've also got the clipping saved in a clippings file in my account on newspapers.com. We'll look at that in just a minute, so you'll see what that looks like. I do also have the option of saving this to Ancestry, but I will tell you, typically, I only use the Save to Ancestry button in newspapers if there is no indexed record that comes up. Like if I find something on newspapers that I couldn't find in one of the indexes on Ancestry. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. We're going to say yes. It's going to walk me through the process of adding this information. You can always edit information. So if the information that was indexed is not completely accurate because it's a computer reading it and interpreting it, they don't do any better or worse than people reading and interpreting it. But you know, any index, you always want to make sure what it's going to save to your tree is accurate and that you're satisfied with that information. So his name in the record is listed as Park W. Cowan. In my tree, I have his full middle name. So I'm not going to check that because I don't want it to overwrite what I already have in my tree. But I do want to make sure that this record is used as a source citation for the fact that this really is his name. Then it's going to add a residence fact, and I'm not going to save that to my tree because he wasn't actually living in Mansfield, Ohio. The information was just reported in the Mansfield, Ohio newspaper because his mom and his siblings were living there. So it was local news about a local, you know, man in his hometown that he grew up in, not in the place where he was currently living. So I do not want to add that residence fact to my tree because that's not actually where he's living at the time. Okay, so then I'm going to save that to tree. And then here's how those newspaper citations are going to show up. They're going to show up in your tree just like any other source citation for a record that you have saved from Ancestry. So if I scroll down here to Ohio, you're going to see there is that newspaper citation that we just saved. I can access it anytime. I can click through to view the actual record, the actual image that way, okay? That is how it saves if you've saved it from Ancestry. If you have saved it from here, from newspapers.com to Ancestry, here's how that's going to show up. All the way below the Ancestry sources, you're going to see what are called other sources. And you'll see here, I have quite a few newspaper articles that I have saved about him directly from newspapers because they didn't come up as part of a newspapers.com index hint on Ancestry, okay? That's the difference between the way the source citation is saved is that way. Now, one thing I do want to point out about this is you typically, when an article is saved, you might see a clipping added to your gallery. These clippings are not intended to be full resolution, fully readable clippings. They're meant to be placeholder thumbnails to let you know that the original image exists on newspapers.com. So you always want to click through from there to newspapers to view the full article. To view the full resolution, okay? That's an important thing. And that has something to do with the license agreements that newspapers.com has with the owners and copyright holders of those newspapers. We can put a thumbnail placeholder on Ancestry, but to view the actual image, you have to go over to newspapers.com, okay? So that's the first way that you're going to come across these newspaper articles is in hints. The second way that you might be able to find them is by doing some searches. And you can do some of those searches directly on Ancestry through that card catalog. So for example, if I was looking to find additional information about Park or his family, I might come here and search the Ohio Newspapers Stories and Events Index. And I might just come in here and put in the last name Cowan and just see what happens. Now, remember I said earlier, you noticed how his last name was spelled differently in the article, 2 different ways in the same newspaper article. That is not uncommon, and it's not uncommon for them to get not just spell last names wrong, but to spell first names wrong, or to sometimes get first names entirely inaccurate or the wrong initials. So you have to think about that as well. Another thing to note is that depending on how much space they have in the newspaper, they may just automatically truncate a name down to initials. So rather than Park W. Cowan, he might be listed as P. W. Cowan or just P. Cowan. And so remember that. And then when it comes to women, very often, right up until the 1960s and 70s, women would not be listed always by their own name. They would be listed as Mrs. Park Cowan. So not even her first name. So remember, as you're looking for people that you might, especially for women, try searching by their husband's name as well. So all of those different nuances. So what I will often do is search a database specifically for just a last name to start with. Now, in this case, I've got 38,000 search results on that last name. If I add a wild card, and one of the wild cards you can add on Ancestry is a question mark. A question mark replaces a single character. So that last vowel in my last name often gets misspelled. C-O-W-A-N, C-O-W-E-N, C-O-W-I-N. So if I just put a question mark in the place of that last vowel, it will catch all of those different spelling variations. And so we go from 38,000 results up to 54,000 results. Crista, you're going the wrong way. Shouldn't we be narrowing in on a search? Yes, but also when you're doing iterative searching, you want to make sure that you're catching as much as possible to start with before you start narrowing in. Now, in this case, I happen to know that the family lived primarily in Ashland, Ohio. I could see if there is an Ashland newspaper. And so I'm going to start by putting the location into the publication info field. And what that will tell me is, was there a newspaper published for that particular location? And in this case, I just took that 54,000 search results right down to 449. And as I start scrolling through this, these are names I recognize. Robert is Park's father, JP is Park's uncle. JP is mentioned a lot. William is another one of the uncles, right? So you can see some of what's happening here. The other thing I could do is I could put Ashland in the keyword field. And what that's going to do is, regardless of where the article was published, if somebody is talking about a member of this family, they almost always will say where they are from. I don't know if you've noticed that when you read newspaper articles, but it'll say like Park Cowan of Ashland, or, you know, Park Cowan of Bucyrus, wherever they happen to be living at the moment. That's true if they're being mentioned in a wedding announcement or in an obituary or in a crime article or in a court document or any of the things that might be published. Even like they would publish sometimes hospital admissions and discharges. And so it will almost always list a name and a location. Bonus, sometimes we also get the age so that we know it's the right person. But if the name of the town that they lived in is consistent and you know it, try searching for that as part of the keyword field, because then it will catch it just being mentioned in the article, regardless of whether that's where the newspaper was published or not. So kind of play around with some of those search fields. Now you'll notice I haven't put any other information in, a surname with a wildcard and a single location, so that I can start going through some of these search results. What you'll notice here, again, sometimes the name is spelled right, sometimes it's spelled wrong. JP is almost always called JP, but sometimes he's called Dr. JP, sometimes he's called Dr. JPR, right? Here he's called Dr. JJ, which is probably still him, but wrong. Okay, sometimes William is listed as William, sometimes it's abbreviated to WM. So think about that as you're thinking about how you're going to search for the people in your family tree. How might they be indexed? And here's Kate, that's one of Park's cousins, right? So you can start to find what you need to find. Now, if you do not want to go through all of these search results, still do this search. You can narrow it in later. But when you start broad, you can skim through these results and start to get an idea for how things are showing up, which can spark ideas about how to search better. And so like I said, surname, single location, see what comes up, kind of go through some of these search results and see what's happening. One thing you'll also notice is that not every one of these things has a date or a residence. And so if you click through to view it, you'll start to understand why some things are indexed the way that they are. It's giving us just the newspaper title and a surname. And if we click through here, this is why, okay? Notice is hereby given that the subscriber has been duly appointed and qualified as executor of the estate of Frederick Einger. Do you ever wonder how some surnames are pronounced and you're like, I'm probably saying that entirely wrong? Late of Ashland County, deceased, Robert Cowan, December 13th, okay? So there is no date listed in this article other than there's no year, there's just a date. And he is providing notice that he's the executor of the estate, and they still managed to spell his name wrong, okay? So Robert is my 3 times great-grandfather. This gives me insight into one of his friends, associates, and neighbors, because certainly there's some kind of a relationship here if he's been assigned as the executor for this man's estate. So this might give me a clue to continue to pursue information about him. It also tells me that this newspaper was published, if you look up here, in 1866, and it was published in January of 1866. So this notice was published December 13th. That means likely of 1865, and that tells me that Robert was still in and around Ashland at that time. Now, the newspaper is called the States and Union, but you're always going to want to come up to the top of the page to see if there is any additional information. And in this case, it is the newspaper is from Ashland. So you can kind of see any header information on the paper. You always want to review that so that you understand, first of all, is this really your person? And second of all, what this information is telling you. That is Robert. So I'm going to come here. I'm going to save it to Robert in my tree. There we go. And again, I am not going to select the name field because they've spelled his name wrong. I don't want it to overwrite what I have in my tree, but I do want to make sure I've got the cite sources box checked so that it connects that newspaper article as a source citation for his name. I could then come in here additionally and add some other facts. For example, if I wanted to flesh out where he was living in 1865, I could add a fact, a custom fact to my tree in 1865, list that he was the executor of this person's will, and then attach this source citation to that fact. So you can decide as you start doing newspapers research how much you want to document of every article that you find. One of the things that I tend to do more frequently is I use the notes feature in Ancestry. So I will come in here and I would scroll down to 1865 and put on 13 December 1865, Robert made notice. That was published in the Ashland Union on 31 January 1866, that he was the executor of the estate of Frederick. I'm going to have to go back and check that that's how that's spelled, but that is how I would make the note in my timeline, in my notes about what this newspaper article tells me. And as you start to collect a bunch of these and you do it this way, you start to understand the story that is emerging. You'll notice patterns and things that happen that you can start to craft an understanding of who they were. Notes, just as a sidebar, notes are private. So my tree is public. Any one of you could do a search right now for Robert Watson Cowan. You'd probably find my tree pretty readily. But the notes that I make are private. They are only viewable by myself and the people I have invited to my tree as editors, which right now is just my two parents. So the three of us. Nobody else would see those notes. So that's where I keep my research notes as I'm kind of working through information and a work in progress. So we've talked about how you get newspapers.com index hints on Ancestry directly in your tree. How you can also come to the card catalog and do a search for newspapers.com and find the specific database that you want to search. And we've talked about some ways to do searches that way. Then the third way to access newspapers.com and search it is to just do it directly. On newspapers.com, you have the option to put in keywords, dates, and locations. Those are the only three search fields. Before you start searching, I would recommend that you come up here in the main menu to Papers and you select Browse. What that's going to show you is what newspapers currently exist. So this is kind of like the card catalog on Ancestry. This is the catalog of what's available on newspapers.com. So if I wanted to come in here and say I'm searching for somebody in the US, so you've got your country first level, and then I'm going to search for Utah, and then I'm going to search for the little town of Lehi, which is where Ancestry is located. And then it will show me that for Lehi, Utah, there were 3 newspapers published that Ancestry has access to: the Lehi Free Press, the Lehi Banner, and the Lehi Sun. You will see this often in communities where newspapers pop up and close, where they change the title. They have different runs, so different time periods when they were published, and then different frequencies within that. So some newspapers are published every day. Some newspapers, there's a morning edition and an evening edition. Some newspapers are only published once a week. Some are published every other day, so it just kind of depends. But when you click that, it will then show you, here are the years that are available for that newspaper. One of the things I want you to notice: 1915, 1916, 1920. Where are 1917, 18, and 19? Okay, so not every newspaper still exists, even if there was a newspaper originally published. And some newspapers stopped publishing for a while and then picked it back up again. In this case, it's possible that it shut down during the time of World War I. Or maybe those newspapers just were lost. They were never preserved. Nobody ever microfilmed them. There's no original copies left anywhere. So you'll see what years are available, and then scroll down and it will show you what years it goes through. And then as you click each of those years, it will show you what editions are available. So in this case, it looks like the Lehi Sun in 1922 was published once a week. And then if I select one of those editions, now I can come in and I can read the newspaper that my great-great-grandparents read every morning here in Lehi, Utah. And I could go through it and read it just like they read it and get a feel for what was happening in their community, who was being mentioned, what was the national news of the day that they might have been concerned about, what was the local news, what were the prices of things, who were the local merchants. Like, you get this entire picture of their community and of the things that they were concerned about in their day by just reading the local newspaper where they may have lived. And I'm just a nerd enough that I love doing that. I love seeing that information and kind of getting a feel for what's happening. So that is one of the ways to browse the record collections on newspapers.com, is by drilling into a specific community and then seeing what's available. Now, you will notice that on some of these newspapers, there's a little plus. That little plus indicates that that particular newspaper is part of what's called Publishers Extra. Those are newspapers that are mostly still in copyright. They're still owned by the original publishers. They have just licensed them to newspapers.com to host them. And so that does require the highest level of subscription. So if you have an Ancestry all access subscription and you purchased that within the last couple of years, you have access to everything on newspapers.com, including those Publisher Extra titles. If you have an old all access subscription that you bought years ago and you just renew every year, you probably are still on the newspaper's basic subscription. And so you might want to look into either upgrading to the newest version of the all access subscription, or you can add newspapers Publisher Extra directly through newspapers.com. So we want to make sure you have as many options as possible to do what works for you. But that little plus sign, that's what that means, is that those are newspapers that are just licensed for us to host because they are still owned by, and in many cases under copyright of, the original publishers. So browsing will help you see what's available. Now, do not discount the fact that just because your ancestor lived in a little community, that there might not have been other little communities around that also would have published local news. So in this case, there are these little towns around Lehigh, there's American Fork, and it looks like they had a newspaper. It looks like they're mentioned as part of the publishing of one of the Lehigh titles. If I come down here to Pleasant Grove, right, there's a paper here that might have additional titles or family members mentioned in those papers as well. So look around the local communities to see what else is happening. So the purpose of the browse is just so that you can see what newspapers exist, in what locations, for what time periods, and get an idea of what's possible. Then you can come in here, and again, I want you to do the same type of a search initially. I'm just going to put in a surname, and then I'm going to put in a state, and then I'm going to click search, and I'm going to see what comes up. In this case, 14,000 matches in the state of Utah for the surname Mulliner. And I can then filter it down, narrow it down. One of the search parameters you can use on newspapers.com are quotation marks. Quotation marks are going to keep information together. So instead of finding the word Samuel and the word Mulliner on the same page of newspaper in two completely different locations, it's going to find them right next to or in close proximity to one another when I put them in quotation marks. And now I've got 195 possible matches. Now, one really cool thing that happens is I searched in the state of Utah. That's why it's highlighted on the map. But the map is also showing me that there are 51 mentions of a Samuel Mulliner in Idaho papers, and one in Montana, and a couple in Nebraska, and one in Missouri, and one in Illinois, and one in Ohio, and one in Pennsylvania, which is interesting to me because this man immigrated from Scotland to Canada, came from Toronto down into Ohio, went from Ohio to Illinois, ended up in Missouri, lived in Nebraska for a while, and then came out to Utah. So that is telling me that those articles may be about him. The other thing that I pay attention to in addition to the map is this sort. I mentioned earlier that often newspapers will report the same news in multiple papers in the same and neighboring communities. And so you'll have the same article show up sometimes on the same day in multiple newspapers, or sometimes in consecutive days in multiple newspapers. The way that the search results are returned on newspapers.com is in a ranked search order, just based on how the algorithm thinks this information closely matches what you searched. I always flip this search to either sort it by oldest or newest date, because then it puts all those articles that are really the same article in multiple newspapers together so that I can quickly skim through them. So while there are 195 matches, some of these may be duplicate, the morning paper and the evening paper and the neighboring paper, all just reporting the same news. Now, as I scroll through these search results, you're going to see a little snippet of where that information is included in the article. And so I can see here, this is an article. He was the first tanner west of the Mississippi. He owned a tanning company in Salt Lake that he started shortly after he got here. And so he would often put articles in the paper or advertisements in the paper requesting people to donate certain things as supplies for the tanning shop. And so he shows up over and over and over again with his, asking for things. And then every once in a while, you'll find an article that is about him rather than from him, right? So here's an article about him going, it looks like, to some kind of an event. Here are two articles that are the same article, probably from a morning paper and an evening paper edition of the paper. Here's another article, it looks like, about him. This looks like it's probably some kind of, either there's mail waiting for him at the post office, or he's been called to vote, or jury duty, or like lists of names like that. Typically that's what those are. So you can kind of start to look for articles about that person. If you have a unique or uncommon name, that's fantastic. If you don't, it gets a little trickier. So for example, if you have somebody who has a common name or a name that is a common word, right? If the last name is Brown, so many search results. You're going to have to get creative about how else you might search. And sometimes that means including the name of a specific town, or if you know the street name of where they lived, or if you know the name of another family member who might have been mentioned. Those are going to help you narrow down those search results if you just add keywords to that particular search. So that is how you're going to do that. And then you're going to click through again to view the article. This looks like it's, oh, it is 1891. He had just died. This is the announcement of his estate going into probate. And then if you want to save that, you can just clip that article and save that to your tree. So that was a whole lot of information to just throw at you for an hour. And it wasn't very story driven. It was a lot of click here, click there. But I hope what it did was it inspired you to go try searching newspapers. Again, in the chat, in the comments, read through those to see what kinds of discoveries other people are making. It might inspire you about the kinds of discoveries that you can make in newspapers. I could not build my family trees or discover my family stories the way that I have without access to newspapers. And newspapers.com is a massive collection, ever growing, and we are always trying to make it more accessible to you by providing those hints and search results directly in Ancestry, or giving you the option to go search directly in newspapers.com. I hope this was educational. I hope this was inspirational, and I can't wait to hear what you have discovered in newspapers. So before you go today, please leave one new thing you learned in the chat or the comments. And then would you please come back to the YouTube video in a week or 2 weeks when you've made the big discovery and let me know what you found. I'm so excited to hear the discoveries that you're making. That's all I have for you today. You can join us every Wednesday here for Ancestry virtual events if you want to participate live, or we have these videos up on the Ancestry YouTube channel, usually within a few days to a week afterwards. You can find the schedule of the next 3 events coming up at ancestry.com/education. That's where you can register. It is free to register, but if you want the Zoom link to participate live, you do have to go through that registration. Until next time, I'm Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.